They called it justice, but anyone with eyes could see it was a setup from the start. This is a fictional narrative set in a fictional town. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental. She walked into that courthouse alone, dust on the hem of her dress. No family, no friend, just silence trailing behind her like a shadow. And you could feel it. That chill, that pause in the air like something sacred had already been broken. Her name? No one seemed to remember. Folks just called her the girl at the mayor's house. That's the thing about silence in a small town. It doesn't mean peace. It means power is being used, and nobody wants to say it out loud. The mayor, Elwood Thatcher, was found dead. Poisoned, they said. Rich man, respected, feared more than loved, but still called a pillar of the community. And when the law came looking for someone to blame, they didn't look far, just to the girl scrubbing his floors. She was the only one in the room when he died. That's all they needed. There were no fingerprints, no motive that made any kind of sense, but logic doesn't matter much when the story's already been written. They didn't need truth. They needed a villain. And she was easy to choose. Quiet, poor, no name that carried weight. In towns like Hollow Rock, that's enough. She sat in the courtroom like she'd been carved from stone, still, silent, eyes down. But the bruises on her neck told a story louder than any testimony. You know the kind of bruises I mean. Not just bruises you can see, the kind that linger, faint, quiet, built from years of silence. And still, no one asked. The saloon emptied early that day. People left their drinks, their card games, their small talk, just to get a good seat in court. It wasn't justice they came for. It was theater, a show. They came to see how a servant girl could kill a man like Thatcher. Or more honestly, how fast the town could swallow someone whole if she didn't have anyone to stand beside her. And maybe that's what got to me the most. Not that she was accused, but that no one, not a soul, asked whether she had anyone to protect her from him while he was still alive. Have you ever walked into a room and known, without anyone saying a word, that you weren't supposed to speak? That your place was to be small, invisible, obedient? Maybe you haven't. But I have. And I saw it in her. The same quiet I learned as a kid, when speaking up only made things worse. She didn't cry. Not during the arrest. Not in court. She didn't flinch when they called her names or whispered behind cupped hands. She just sat there, hands folded neatly in her lap, like someone who learned a long time ago that the world isn't fair, and sometimes surviving means letting them think you're numb. What made it worse was the way the town played along. The same sheriff who once tipped his hat to her at the market now stood by the door like she was something dangerous. A boy who used to smile when she passed with the laundry basket couldn't even look her in the eye. Even the old woman from the bakery, the one who had once given her a stale roll when she thought no one saw, turned her face away. It wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about comfort. And letting her suffer was more comfortable than facing what they had all allowed to happen under their noses. There's something ugly about watching a town pretend it doesn't know. That it hasn't heard the yelling through the windows, that it hasn't seen the bruises, that it doesn't know what men like Thatcher are capable of when the door shuts and no one's watching. But this girl, this silent, nameless girl, they expected her to crumble. And she didn't. Not yet. So yes, they said it was a fair trial, but it wasn't. It was a funeral, not for the mayor, for truth. And everyone in that room, every man, woman, and child, was there not to see if she was guilty, but to feel a little more certain that the world still worked the way they wanted it to. That rich men die respected, and poor girls die forgotten. But something was shifting. You could feel it even then.
And before this story ends, you'll see what happens when someone walks back into the silence, not to break it with noise, but with truth. And once truth speaks, it doesn't need to shout to be heard.
The trial began the way storms do in the desert, quiet but heavy, like the air knew something was about to break. They called her to the stand, but she didn't speak. Not because she was hiding anything, but because no one in that room was really listening. They'd already made up their minds. To them, she wasn't a woman. She was a headline, a lesson, a warning. The prosecutor stood tall, voice sharp as barbed wire, bottle in hand. "Belladonna," he said, "the devil's herb." Claimed she'd used it to poison the mayor while he slept. One drop, and he was gone. Said she'd done it out of spite, out of jealousy, out of rage. That she was bitter because her master only ever saw her as a shadow in his house. And the town? They nodded, murmured, believed. Because stories like that are easy to digest, easier than facing the cracks in their own walls. But no one asked the right questions. No one wondered why the poison was found in his drawer. No one mentioned how the mayor had been getting sicker for months, slow, quiet, like a candle burning out long before the wind arrived. And not a single soul asked what she stood to gain by killing the man who signed her pay, pitiful as it was. Have you ever watched someone be judged for what they seem to be, not who they are? It's a slow kind of violence, the kind you can feel in the way people look through you instead of at you. Her defense attorney? He barely spoke. A local man, polite to a fault, with sweat on his brow and not much else. He cleared his throat, stood up, and managed a weak, "There's no real proof." That's all he said before the judge cut him off like a schoolboy caught talking out of turn, told him to sit down. A few people in the crowd chuckled. And she didn't move, didn't flinch, just kept her hands folded, back straight, her hair pulled so tight it looked painful. But pain, I think, was nothing new to her. I remember watching a documentary once about wrongful convictions. The common thread wasn't always evidence, it was silence. The kind of silence that happens when no one powerful cares enough to question what's easy. That's what this was. The judge, old friend of the deceased, wore the robe like armor, but his eyes told the truth. He wasn't looking for justice, he was balancing favors, loyalty over law. The jury didn't deliberate. They didn't need to. They weren't listening for facts. They were searching for confirmation. Something to tell them that the world still made sense, that rich men die as victims and poor women are to blame when they do. And maybe that's the part that sits the heaviest with me, that justice in that room wasn't blind. It had its eyes wide open. It just chose to look the other way. She was on trial, yes, but it wasn't really about poison. It wasn't about death. It was about power. About a girl who didn't scream when she was meant to, who didn't play the part they'd written for her. They mistook her silence for guilt, not survival. Her stillness for coldness, not control. And so, the verdict wasn't spoken that day, but it may as well have been carved in stone. Everyone had their story, and she didn't fit it. But let me ask you this. How many people in your life are only one accusation away from being destroyed? Not because of what they've done, but because they don't have the kind of voice that gets heard. I think about that a lot, because sometimes the most dangerous thing in a courtroom isn't the lie, it's what gets left unsaid.
Sometimes when a person's quiet for too long, the world forgets there's a reason. They see silence as weakness, or worse, consent. But silence is often survival. The girl on trial had lived most of her life slipping between walls, floors, houses, places that never wanted her but kept her all the same. She'd been passed around like an old broom, useful, invisible, replaceable. Each home a little colder than the last, each master a little crueler. And she learned early on that noise didn't save you, not when no one wanted to hear it. By the time she came to work for Mayor Elwood Thatcher, she was already practiced in the art of vanishing. Walk softly, speak only when spoken to, smile when you're expected. That was the rhythm of her life. Now, Thatcher, he had a reputation. Polished boots, polite nods, a churchman on Sundays and a monster the rest of the week. He called her girl, never her name. Not once. He liked control, the kind that hides behind a closed door and a charming smile. And he exercised that control in the smallest, most intimate ways. He would strike her for breaking a dish, then hand her a few coins the next day and call it extra. Said it was for her trouble. A punishment wrapped in pity. A wound followed by a reward. Like training a dog to fear and follow in equal measure. I've seen this kind of man before. Maybe you have too. The kind who wears decency like a disguise. The guy who builds a cage and calls it shelter. I remember once, back when I was a teenager, a girl in our neighborhood ran away from home. Everyone whispered she was trouble, that she had issues, but no one asked why. No one cared that her father kept the windows shut and the porch light off. She came back 2 weeks later, quieter than before. And after that, we all learned not to ask about bruises you didn't want to understand. That's what this girl lived through. Not just the blows, but the world's refusal to believe they happened. She'd thought about running, once, but where would she go? Who would take her in? What man would believe the word of a servant over the mayor of Hollow Rock? So she stayed. Because sometimes staying feels safer than leaping into nothing. Sometimes it feels like the only choice left. And that's the part people never talk about. They want victims to be loud, to cry, to scream, to fight back with fists and fire and proof. But not everyone survives that way. Some people survive by disappearing, by folding into the wallpaper and holding their breath long enough to make it to tomorrow. That's what she did. She stayed quiet. She endured. And every time someone looked at her and didn't see the bruises, every time they heard the shouting and chose to ignore it, her silence sank a little deeper into her bones. The thing is, you can only live like that for so long before you start to forget you matter. By the time the trial came, she already knew how the story would go. Knew that the courtroom wouldn't welcome her truth any more than those houses had. Knew that the bruises, the pain, the night she went to bed hungry, trembling, hiding pain that no one cared to see, none of that would save her now. Because she'd spent her life hiding the evidence. And the world had learned how to look away. But somewhere in that silence, under the dust and shame and fear, there was still a spark. Small, steady, waiting. Maybe that's the most dangerous thing about a woman they've written off. She knows how to be quiet, but one day she might remember how to speak. And when she does, the whole town will have to listen.
They say ghosts don't come back, but in Hollow Rock, one did. And he didn't need chains or a headstone to haunt the town. Just a name, Cole Maddox. It started with a whisper, like the wind before a storm. A man in a long coat, dust on his boots, a revolver heavy on his hip. But it wasn't the weapon that turned heads. It was the silence he carried with him. Like he'd seen too much, said too little, and still remembered everything. No one saw him arrive, not really. He just was, like he'd stepped out from the shadows of the past. Took a seat in the far corner of the saloon, ordered a single cup of coffee, and didn't drink a drop. The piano player froze mid-song, the bartender dropped a glass, and someone whispered the name that hadn't been spoken in years, not out loud anyway, Cole Maddox.
You could feel the air change when it left their lips, like the room itself remembered. Now Cole wasn't a lawman, not exactly, and he wasn't an outlaw either, not the kind with a price on his head. He was something in between. A man with a history sharp enough to make people forget how to breathe. Some said he used to ride with posses. Others swore he was a bounty hunter turned vigilante. But the stories all ended the same way. He vanished, one night, gone like smoke. Until now. And what brought him back? That girl, the one on trial, the one the town had already judged and set aside like a broken tool. Most people in Hollow Rock didn't even know he used to work for the mayor, or if they did, they pretended not to. Thatcher had once called him a necessary evil, his words, not mine. Said Cole was useful in times when the law needed to look the other way. A man you paid not to protect you, but to remind others why you didn't need protecting. But that kind of man, when he turns his back on a town, leaves a silence that rots deep. So when he walked back through those doors, just as the verdict was closing in, people didn't ask why. They asked, what does he know? Because a man like Cole doesn't come back without a reason, and he sure as hell doesn't come to watch a woman hang for a crime she didn't commit. There's a weight to stillness. Have you ever felt that? Like being in a room with someone who carries more than they say. That's what it was like when Cole sat in that booth, eyes shadowed under the brim of his hat. He didn't need to threaten anyone. He just was, and that was enough. I've seen people like that, men who've seen justice fail one too many times, who know that truth doesn't always shout, and sometimes it dies in polite silence. I don't know if Cole came back because he loved her, or because he owed her, or maybe just because he saw in her what the rest of the town refused to see. But I do know this. When someone like Cole Maddox walks into town, people remember the parts of themselves they tried to forget. And maybe that's the most dangerous thing of all. Because Hollow Rock didn't fear his gun. They feared what he came to uncover, and the truth he might not leave buried.
The room was still. Too still. You know that kind of silence that comes before something irreversible? That's what it felt like in that courthouse. The judge had already lifted his gavel. His voice, steady and rehearsed, began to echo through the chamber like a funeral bell. The girl stood there in chains, expression hollow, eyes dim. Her dress hung looser than when she'd first worn it to court, as if even the fabric had given up on holding her together. Everyone knew what was coming. She was guilty, at least in their minds. There'd be no final defense, no last-minute witness, no miracle. And then the doors creaked open. Bootsteps followed, measured, deliberate, echoing against wood and shame. Every head turned before the judge could even finish his sentence. And there he was, Cole Maddox, the ghost, the legend, the shadow no one wanted to face. He didn't look around for permission. He just walked straight down the center aisle like he belonged there, like he'd always belonged in places no one else dared to stand. And when he stopped, just behind her, he didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "She's my wife." You could feel the breath leave the room all at once. A gasp here, a choked cough there. Somewhere a child whimpered. And the judge, who had moments ago been so sure, squinted at Cole like he was seeing a bad dream walk straight into the daylight. "What did you say?" the judge barked, trying to recover his balance. Cole didn't flinch. He said, "She's my wife," again, voice like gravel soaked in resolve. And then slow and careful, he reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed around the edges but intact, a marriage license, filed in Dust Creek 2 years ago. The sheriff stepped forward, took it with trembling hands, read it once, twice, and looked over at the girl. She didn't nod, didn't react. Her silence wasn't new, But something had shifted in her posture. She didn't stand taller, exactly, but she stood differently, like someone had just laid a hand on her shoulder after a lifetime of cold rooms. The judge was livid. "Even if this is true, it has no bearing on her guilt." But that wasn't the point. Cole turned to the room, his back to the bench, his voice clear. "It has bearing on why none of you stood beside her, because none of you knew. You didn't ask. You didn't care. She begged for help, and you all turned your heads. She was alone not because she was guilty, but because you made it so." That struck something in me, maybe in everyone. Have you ever watched someone suffer and convinced yourself it wasn't your problem? I think we all have. We call it minding our business. We say we don't know the whole story. But really it's fear dressed up as neutrality. And that's what Cole was dragging out into the open. Not just a marriage license, but a mirror. He said you watched her starve, watched her bruise, watched her disappear, and you said nothing. So I will. That wasn't a confession of love. It wasn't romantic. It was something harder, something truer. It was a man standing in front of a town and saying, "If you won't see her, I will." The judge tried to press on, tried to resume control, but it was too late. The moment had cracked open something deeper than a trial. And you could tell right then that the story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone in that room who had once chosen comfort over conscience. She didn't cry, she didn't collapse, but her hands, always folded, always still, they shook. And for the first time in that courtroom, her silence wasn't lonely. It was heard. Truth doesn't always kick the door down. Sometimes it walks in quiet. Sometimes it waits. And when it finally speaks, it doesn't need to shout. That's what happened that day in Hollow Rock. After Cole Maddox made his stand, after the shock of his words settled like dust over the courtroom, something changed. It was subtle at first. A long pause. The kind of silence that presses on your chest, not because there's nothing to say, but because everyone finally realizes they should have said something a long time ago. Cole didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply laid the truth out like cards on a table. And he started with the one thing this town had been so good at ignoring: proof. From his coat, he pulled out a worn piece of paper, creased but clean. An old medical report, signed by the town doctor. It detailed serious injuries, a cracked rib, internal damage, all hidden, all treated in silence, never reported. He held the report out with steady hands. She wasn't angry, he said. She was surviving. There was no applause, just breath, held by everyone in that room. And then, the first crack. A woman in the back of the room stood up, shaky, small. It was the baker's wife. She looked like someone who'd been waiting for permission to stop lying to herself. "I saw how he treated her," she said, voice trembling. "He made her kneel in silence while he drank." Her words landed heavy, not because they were surprising, but because they weren't. Then came the housemaid. She stepped forward, hands clenched at her sides. "She cleaned his chamber pot while she had a fever," she said. "I begged him to let her rest." He laughed. The air got thicker. The truth was starting to fill the room like smoke. Even the piano man, the one who hadn't played a note since Cole walked into town, rose from his bench. "I saw the bruises on her arms 2 years ago. Thought it wasn't my place." Isn't that what we always say? It's not my place? We convince ourselves we're being respectful, or careful, or neutral. But really, we're just scared of what it would cost to care out loud. I've felt that fear. Maybe you have too. That aching sense that speaking up might flip your whole world upside down. But silence, especially in the face of cruelty, doesn't keep us safe. It keeps us complicit. One by one, the town began to shift, not just in bodies, but in spirit. Shoulders sagged under the weight of their own regret, eyes dropped, not out of respect, but shame. The judge, once so firm and righteous behind his bench, leaned back in his chair, not with authority, but exhaustion, like a man waking up after years of pretending to be asleep. He didn't bang the gavel, didn't declare her innocent. He just said, "This court is in recess, pending further review of new evidence and witness testimony." And with that, the trial didn't end. But something else did. The lie. When they let her out of the room, the chains were gone. No man shouted, no one cheered. The town just watched. Watched a woman they once called nothing walk out of the courtroom without shackles, for the first time, not as a ghost, not as a rumor, but as someone who had been seen. It's strange, isn't it? How truth, when it finally arrives, doesn't feel like lightning. It feels like breath, like relief, like maybe, just maybe, justice is possible if someone's willing to speak when everyone else stays quiet. There's something unsettling about seeing yourself through someone else's eyes, especially when that reflection isn't kind. After Cole Maddox stood up in court, after he tore the silence wide open with nothing but truth and stillness, the town of Hollow Rock started to see itself, and it didn't like what stared back. You could feel it shift, not all at once, but slowly, like waking from a long, uneasy dream. The townsfolk had spent years pretending they didn't hear the screams behind closed doors, pretending bruises could be explained, pretending that power always meant virtue. But Cole, he didn't let them pretend anymore. He didn't make speeches, he didn't march, he just existed, unapologetically, and somehow that was louder than anything else. You ever had someone show up in your life and hold a mirror so clear that you couldn't look away? Someone who didn't say, "You're wrong," but simply lived in a way that made your silence louder than your words. That was Cole. He didn't force the town to confess. He made it impossible for them to keep lying. Even the doctor, the one who everyone thought too proper to be part of anything ugly, walked into the sheriff's office that night, head down, hands shaking. He said, "I treated her, more than once. Fractures, fevers, wounds that couldn't be explained with accidents or clumsiness. He saw it all. But he said nothing because he was afraid of Elwood Thatcher, afraid of losing his position, his reputation, his comfort. And now, he was afraid of himself. I think we've all known someone like that. Someone who tells themselves that looking away isn't the same as harm, that staying quiet is neutral. But silence has weight, and eventually it starts to crush the people we leave behind. The sheriff didn't scold the doctor, didn't demand a reason. He just said, softly, "You're not the only one." Because by then, they all knew. They were all guilty, not of the crime itself, but of letting it happen, of watching her disappear piece by piece and saying nothing because it was easier. And that ease, it finally turned sour. The courthouse, once proud and echoing with judgment, couldn't hold the truth anymore. It was too full of rot. So when the trial resumed, it didn't happen there. It happened at the church, a place where people hoped for grace, even if they didn't deserve it. There were no robes, no gavel, no ornate speeches, just benches filled with faces trying not to look ashamed. The baker and his wife sat in the front, the housemaid behind them, the piano man, hands trembling on his knees, even the sheriff, even the doctor. And Cole, he stood in the back, arms crossed, watching, waiting. He didn't need to speak again. He had already said the only thing that mattered.
And she, the girl they almost let die without a name, walked into that church with no chains, no guard, no bowed head. She didn't need saving. She needed space. And for the first time, she had it. I remember thinking as I listened to her speak, quiet, steady, honest, that this was what justice could look like. Not the kind in books, not the kind with fancy words and cold verdicts, but the kind that starts when people finally stop hiding behind fear. This town had been built on silence, on pride, on looking the other way, but now it had to face itself. And maybe in that reflection, there was still a chance at redemption. Because truth doesn't just convict, it awakens. And Hollow Rock, it had finally opened its eyes.
The church was packed, but it wasn't the kind of crowd you'd find on a Sunday morning. This wasn't a gathering for hymns or blessings. It was something quieter, heavier. The kind of silence that only comes when people know they've got something to answer for. They couldn't go back to the courthouse, not after what happened. That place had lost its voice. So the people of Hollow Rock brought their shame, their questions, and their need for truth to the only place left that still had any meaning. And then she walked in. The girl. No chains, no guard, no bowed head. She didn't wear anything grand, just the same plain dress. But she wore it differently now. Straighter. Like the weight she carried had shifted from burden to clarity. She sat down at the front, in that old wooden witness chair, and for the first time since this all began, she spoke. I didn't kill him. That's all it took. 4 words. Not shouted, not whispered, just said, honest and tired, like someone who had nothing left to lose but still chose to speak. And in that moment, the truth didn't just rise, it settled. She went on slowly, no drama, no appeal for pity, just her truth. She talked about the nights she prayed, even when her voice felt small and useless. About the mornings she woke up hoping someone, anyone, would notice the bruises, the fever, the way her silence screamed. But no one came. And then, one by one, the town started answering her. The housemaid stood first, tears already in her eyes. I begged him to let her rest, she said. She had a fever. She could barely stand. He just laughed. The baker's wife followed. He made her kneel while he drank. I saw it. I said nothing. Then came the stable boy. He hurt her, he said. I saw it once. She dropped a glass. That's all it took. I thought it wasn't my place. And on it went. Not a courtroom anymore, but a confession. Have you ever been part of a moment where everything shifts, not because someone shouted louder, but because people finally stopped lying? That's what it felt like in that church. They weren't defending her. They were facing themselves. And when the judge, stripped of his robe, now just a man in a suit, looked out over the room, he didn't ask for a verdict. He didn't need to. Because when truth is that clear, you don't need a gavel. You just need the courage to let go of what you thought was right. There was no sentence read that day, no declaration of guilt or innocence, just a long, aching pause. And then she stood, not with pride, not with vengeance, just with the quiet dignity of someone who had finally been heard. She didn't need the town to love her. She needed them to see her. And for once, they did.
They left Hollow Rock just as the sun slipped behind the ridge, quietly, without ceremony, without goodbyes. No packed crowd, no waving hands, just dust rising beneath tired boots and the long shadow of a place that finally saw them for who they were and didn't know what to do with it. She didn't look back, and Cole didn't ask her to. There was no plan, no map, just movement, away from the silence that once swallowed her whole and towards something she didn't yet have a name for. As they rode, the world felt wide again. Not safe, not simple, but open. And maybe that was enough. When they reached the small roadside inn just beyond the last bend, the wooden sign above the door creaked in the wind. Mercy's Rest. The kind of place that didn't ask questions. The kind built for people who needed to breathe, not explain. Inside, the room was dim, warm, worn down in the way that makes you feel less alone. A single lantern swung slightly above a table. The woman behind the counter didn't flinch when she saw them. She just nodded, handed Cole a key, and said, "Room's yours if you want it." They sat near the fire. Not close, but not far. Like two people still learning how to exist beside someone who doesn't want to take anything from them. She didn't speak for a long time, just sat, hands folded, spine straight, out of habit, not comfort. When the stew came, she hesitated. Her fingers trembled slightly when they touched the spoon. It had been so long since she'd eaten without fear, without someone watching, waiting to punish her for being hungry. Cole didn't push. He just ate slowly, his eyes scanning the room, always listening to the things people didn't say. She ate half the bowl before setting it down. He nudged his own toward her without a word. And in that small gesture, something settled between them. Not love, not yet, maybe not ever, but something true, something real, a quiet that didn't demand explanation. Later that night, as the fire burned low, she finally asked him, "The marriage papers, were they real?" He nodded. "Real enough, just never filed." She looked at him, eyes unreadable. "Why?" He paused, then said, "Because they'd believe me before they'd believe you." She didn't answer right away. She didn't have to. The room did it for her. The weight of what that meant, the injustice so plain it no longer needed pointing out. After a while, she said, "I don't want to stay in Hollow Rock." Cole nodded. "But I don't want to walk alone anymore." He didn't smile, didn't reach out. He just looked at her the way no man ever had. Not like she was broken or dangerous or fragile, but like she mattered. And maybe that was the beginning of something. Not a romance, not a rescue, but a promise between two people who knew what it meant to lose everything and still keep going. I think about that sometimes. How healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just sharing stew in silence, or straightening a spoon, or riding away from the place that almost buried you. They didn't ride far that first night, just far enough for Hollow Rock to disappear in the dark behind them, just far enough for her to begin breathing without bracing. At Mercy's Rest, she wasn't anyone's servant, she wasn't the girl with no name, she was someone beginning again. And sometimes, that's everything.
She was never meant to be remembered, not in a town like Hollow Rock. A nameless servant girl passed between homes like an extra pair of hands, never a voice, never a story, just someone in the background, quiet, invisible. The kind of person the world uses and forgets. And for a long time, she believed that's all she'd ever be. But now she's not the ghost at the edge of the room, not the bruises no one talked about, not the silence that made everyone more comfortable. She's the woman who stood in front of a town that had already buried her. and was seen. And when I think about everything that happened, what she went through, what the town let happen, I realize something. This story was never just about justice. It was about something deeper, something quieter. It was about compassion. It was about the courage it takes to speak when your voice shakes, to tell the truth when no one wants to hear it, to survive in a world that rewards silence and still find the strength to say, I matter. It was about the people who finally stood beside her, not as saviors, but as witnesses, who said, we failed you, and meant it, who chose discomfort over denial. And maybe most of all, it was about Cole, a man with his own shadows who didn't ride in to fix her story or rewrite it, but to stand beside it, to say, you are not alone, and mean it in every step he didn't force her to take, every word he didn't make her explain. Because that's the thing no one tells you when you're barely holding on. Sometimes you don't need rescuing. You just need someone to stand with you in the dark. Someone to hold a space you didn't think you deserved. I think about that more than I care to admit. How many people around us are carrying too much alone? People who've convinced themselves they're meant to be invisible, that asking for help is weakness, that their pain doesn't count because someone else has it worse. And I wonder what would happen if, just once, someone looked them in the eye and said, I see you. Maybe that's all it takes to start over. Not justice from a courtroom, not headlines or heroes, but one person, one moment, one voice that says, you are not invisible. You are not forgotten, and you are not alone. So wherever you are tonight, if you've ever felt like the world passed you by, if you've ever wondered if your story matters, I want you to know you're not alone.